Welcome to today's lesson on Darwin and the theory of evolution. Here is a portrait of Charles Darwin as a young man. He's only 27 years old, and he just returned from his voyage on this ship known as the Beagle. Charles Darwin is best known for his theory of evolution, which includes two basic ideas. First, that evolution does in fact occur, which means that organisms as species, not as individuals, but as species, change over time. And then the second part of that is that evolution occurs by the mechanism of natural selection. And natural selection says that living things with beneficial traits produce more offspring, and that results in changes in populations over time. In Darwin's day, people believed that all species were created at once, at the same time, and they remained unchanged. They also believed that the Earth was really young. It was only 6,000 years old. So Darwin's ideas were in sharp contrast to the current ideas of the time. And as a young man, Charles Darwin wanted to go on an adventure. He was interested in nature, and he was a scientist at heart. So he went on this adventure on the HMS Beagle as a naturalist on board. And as a naturalist, he collected specimens of plants, of animals, of rocks, of fossils. He made observations. He recorded his observations in notebooks that we still have. In tropical rainforests, he was super impressed by the diversity of life. He experienced an earthquake that lifted the ocean floor. He found fossils of seashells in mountains where there was no water at all. He dug up fossils of giant extinct animals, such as the giant sloth. Here is a map showing you the Beagle's journey and where it went. And you can see at some point we're going around South America, and we get to these islands known as the Galapagos. Here's an image of picture of Charles Darwin as an older man. And this is Charles Darwin's famous turtle, celebrity turtle known as Harriet. And she lived to be a ripe old age because she only died in 2006. The Galapagos Islands are very unique because there's 16 small volcanic islands actually off the coast of South America, off the coast of Ecuador. And they're unique because each island is different from the next one. Some islands are rocky, some are dry, some have good soil, some have poor soil, some have lots of rain, some don't. And not only are the islands different, but the organisms that live on them are different. So if you jump from one island to the next, you're going to find very different plants and animal species than you do in the next island over. And Charles Darwin noticed that on each island, the animals were uniquely adapted to the environment in which they lived. Here is the Galapagos Islands, another map. And here are some of Charles Darwin's observations. He saw these giant marine iguanas on some islands. This is known as the blue-footed booby. And this is an example of a giant sloth. And remember, Charles Darwin actually dug up fossils of the giant sloth. And he was just fascinated by this enormous organism. And you can see, for scale, it's standing next to a person over here. So there were influences on Darwin. He didn't just come up with his theory of evolution right away. There were important people that influenced his thinking. And the first one is Lamarck. And Lamarck actually proposed that species changed over time, unlike the predominant idea, which is that species were all made at once and they just stay the same. But Lamarck had a different idea for how that happened. Lamarck believed in something known as the inheritance of acquired characteristics. This turned out to be an incorrect idea. And it's the idea that organisms do things in their life that changes them, and then they can pass those traits on. So for example, he believed that a long time ago giraffes had really short necks, but they spent their whole life stretching their necks to get leaves that were out of reach. And because they were stretching their whole life, their necks got long, and then their children were born with long necks. This turns out to not be how evolution works. However, Lamarck was influential on Darwin. The second person is Lyell. He was a geologist. And he studied geological processes that shape the Earth, and he believed through his research that the Earth was way older than most people believed. He said there's no way that the Earth could only be 6,000 years old, and Charles Darwin was aware of his work. The third is Malthus. He was an economist, and he argued that human populations grow faster than the resources that they depend on, right? So they grow faster than the food that is needed to feed them and the space that is needed to hold them. And famine and disease always kill off the weakest members of populations. The last one is not a person, it's an idea. It's the idea of artificial selection, which was known at Darwin's time. Humans can breed plants and animals with useful traits, so they can change species to suit their needs, and all our crops have been created in this way, right? Like we have giant strawberries, for example, instead of tiny wild strawberries. That's artificial selection. That's actually a type of evolution in a sense. So here is another example. Wolves all share the common ancestor of the, not wolves, dogs all share the common ancestor of the gray wolf. And humans have bred different varieties to suit their specific needs and opinions and interests. So you can see these varieties of dogs. Some of them are not well adapted for nature at all. But Darwin was aware of artificial selection. Okay. So evolution of Darwin's ideas. Building on these theories by these scientists and his observations, Darwin believed that the overproduction of offspring led to what is known as a struggle for existence. So he believed that organisms needed to compete with each other because of these limited resources. Offspring with variations that are more likely to survive this struggle reproduce, and they pass on these traits. So for example, if you have a shark that's really strong and fast, it's more likely to survive and get seals to eat and then reproduce. Fitness is an organism's ability to survive and produce fertile offspring. And then natural selection, nature selects variations that are the most useful. Organisms with useful traits survive and reproduce, the rest die off. So this is Darwin's idea of how giraffes got their long neck. So he believed that way back in time, most giraffes had short necks. All of a sudden, though, by accident, through something known as a mutation, a random event, one giraffe was born with a slightly longer neck. And this giraffe ended up having a survival advantage because he could eat leaves not only on short shrubs, but he could eat leaves up high in the trees. So if there was a famine and there weren't that many resources, this giraffe had a higher chance of surviving because it could eat more food. So this giraffe ended up surviving, reproducing, and passing on his genes to his offspring. And in the generations that came later, more and more giraffes with long neck were able to survive and reproduce. And as you went through many, many generations, a greater portion of the population ended up having long necks, and over time, the short-necked giraffes died off. And this is Darwin's idea of evolution. It's not like one giraffe evolved, it changed, and it grew its neck. It's basically randomly some giraffes were born with long necks and they passed on their genes. And over time, the population evolved. So over time, the population changed so that mostly long-necked giraffes survived. Survival of the fittest. Individuals with adaptations well suited to their environment can survive and reproduce. They have a high level of fitness. Individuals not well suited die without reproducing, or they leave few offspring. Here is another example that is well documented. This involves moths called peppered moths. And peppered moths, before the Industrial Revolution, were this light color. And you can actually see it here on this image. Circled here is a peppered moth. You can't see it as well because it blends in, it camouflages really well. So before the Industrial Revolution, populations of these peppered moths were almost all this light whitish color. And there were very, very few ones that were this black color. So the population was predominantly a white colored species. Then the Industrial Revolution happened, which was fueled by the burning of coal, which is really, really dirty. And the trees were coated with this dark soot. So the environment changed, and these white-colored moths were no longer adapted to their environment. And what happened over time is that the white-colored moths ended up being eaten by predators, and the black-colored moths ended up surviving, passing on their genes, having young, and the young survived and passed on their genes and had more young. And over time, the population evolved to the point where it became a mostly dark-colored species with very few light-colored individuals. That's evolution. And this was later repeated by other scientists, and they found that whenever there were low levels of pollution, the population would change so that it would be all white species, and when there was pollution, the population would change so that it was predominantly this black color. Okay. Descent with modification. Darwin proposed that over many generations, adaptations could cause successful species to evolve into new species. He also proposed that all living things shared or descended from ancient common ancestors. They shared ancestors, and that included human beings. He said that living things all share a common ancestor that came before them a long, long time ago. And he believed that a single tree of life links all living things. This idea was super, super radical, and Darwin held off for a very long time, and he didn't publish his results because it was in direct contradiction to what was accepted at the time, to the teachings of the church, and he was really afraid of how his ideas would be received. So I hope that was a helpful introduction to evolution. Thank you so much for listening.